In this March of the Machine draft meta update, I'll be providing you with the most current information on the format so you can crush your next draft. Starting things off with the format news, our first headline is which battles are worth it. And the way I've been evaluating them and the way many top players are evaluating them is based on mostly the front half of the card, because they almost all flip into just incredible cards on the back, but you really need to worry about what the front side of the card does, because if the battle doesn't flip, that's all you're going to get. So a card like Invasion of Amonkhet is just where you want to be with your battles, because the front half of the card makes your opponent discard and lets you draw a card. So you're getting a 2-for-1 for just 3 mana, which is already a pretty solid card, and then if you can flip it, it becomes even better. Invasion of Kamigawa, on the other hand, is a battle that you're not as interested in, because for 4 mana, you're just tapping your opponent's creature and putting a stun counter on it, which is not an effect that is worth 4 mana, and so Invasion of Kamigawa is a lot worse. And so that's just a very good baseline for evaluating the battles. Don't get too overwhelmed by reading both sides of the card, mostly focus in on that front side, and if that's worth it, the battle is almost certainly going to be worth it. The next headline is, are the rares too strong? Because there are a lot of very powerful rares in the pack, and there's also the extra multiverse legend slot in the pack where you can get a card like Grim Corpseborn, and then in the normal rare slot, a card like Glissa can just take over the game, and then Sunfall is just a monocolored card that's also just rare as a normal rarity, and is just can end the game and be very hard to deal with. And so the question of are the rares too strong has been coming onto a lot of players' minds. And I think that the general thought process behind this is, first of all, are the rares easy to interact with? And I would say that there is very strong removal in this format that can be used to deal with a lot of the rares. So if your opponent plays a Glissa, and then you kill it, sure, they might get a little bit of card advantage from the first turn that it's in play, but if you deal with it right away, then you can have still have a game plan and still win the game. So there are a lot of very powerful rares, and there are some that are almost impossible to beat, but that's true in almost any format, and I think that the power level of the format as a whole is high enough to contain most of the rares. So if you do get wrecked by one of the best ones, that's going to happen in any format, but I think that there are a lot of rares that are strong, but not game-breakingly strong in this format. So we're going to keep tabs on this situation going forward, but I would say that the rares don't ruin the format, in my opinion. And then the final thing as a headline is that 5-color is a real deck. There have been a lot of players talking about this. They talked about it on Limited Resources a bit even, which is a major podcast in the limited scene. And the way that you're going to build this deck is you're going to prioritize the gain lands like Blossoming Sands, which will enter the battlefield tapped and gain you a life, and also tap for one of 2 different colors. And then Blighted Burgeoning is a really important card for this deck as well. And there's also other fixing like Skittering Surveyor, but I've been really impressed by Blighted Burgeoning, and so a lot of these decks are probably going to be base green as a result. And then you can even cast 5-color cards like Niv Mizzet Reborn. There's also a 5-color battle that you can cast, and just play all of the best cards and play a lot of those strong rares, which oftentimes have relatively color intense requirements, so you can maybe get them a little bit later because other players might not be able to play them. So if you are interested and you are a more experienced drafter, 5-color is something that you can do in this format. Next up, we're going to be moving to the meta market, and the first thing we're going to be talking about is the archetype rankings, because now that we've played the format a little bit, it's been out for a while, there are some consensus best decks. And the first one is Blue-Black Graveyard. It can also be a bit of a Convoke deck, where it just plays a bunch of cheap cards and then just has very high card quality, good synergy, has some good rares and uncommons, and so Blue-Black Graveyard at number 1. Next is Blue-White Knights, which is the premier aggro deck of the format. Blue-White just plays as a very tempo-y deck. The Knights are very good at attacking, and they work very well together. Next is Green-Black Incubate. Green-Black can often be a good shell for splashing, and Green-Black is also just a nice grindy deck in the format. Number 4 is Blue-Red Convoke. This is a strategy that plays cheap creatures and then convokes out big spells, and overall it kind of relies on having those early creatures so that you can play your big spells later, but it's also one of the synergy decks that's easiest to assemble because you just need to really prioritize 2 different things. You don't have a ton of like balls in the air, as the saying goes. Next is Blue-Green Transform. This often will be a deck that splashes, so don't think of this as purely a blue-green deck. Blue-green on its own can oftentimes lack in key areas like removal and interaction, but blue-green as a transform late game type deck can be a nice little strategy for a splash around type of deck, and maybe even those like 5-color variants or 3 or 4 colors as well. Next is Green-White Counters. It's a nice aggressive deck, but it is a little bit on the lower end of the spectrum just because it doesn't have quite as powerful of cards. But still, if you are drafting this deck, you'll want to prioritize cards that put counters on your creatures and combat tricks so you can push through damage. And you'll also want to make sure that if you are going to try to make one creature in particular very large, that you'll have some protection available for it. Next is Black-Red Sacrifice. It has some good pieces in this format, but oftentimes it's kind of nickel and diming your opponent, and then they just play a very strong card, or they'll just go over the top of you in the late game. So you need to make sure that if you are going to be playing this deck, that you have good early game and just good synergy pieces throughout, so that you can be doing strong things at all points on the curve, because there is a good amount of card advantage, and you can sometimes just fall behind other grindy decks because you don't have access to as much card draw sometimes. Next is Red-Green Battles. It is very strong when it comes together, and this ranking is a just way of kind of, if you have like a close pick between like a blue-black card and a red-green card early, you'd want to default to the blue-black card, but red-green, I've had success with it. It has some very powerful cards, and it is the sort of deck that can be very aggressive and get off to a good start, but the problem is that some of the cards that care about battles aren't as well supported, because you don't always end up with tons of great battles, and you don't always have room to include as many battles if you want to still have removal and a functional curve, so that's why the deck suffers a little. And then moving down to number 9, Black-White Phyrexians. It's a little bit slow sometimes. That's the main caveat I have about it, because you generally need to be spending 2 mana to flip your incubate tokens, which means that sometimes you can get run over or tempoed out of the game by a deck like White-Blue Knights while you're waiting to flip your incubate tokens, and then sometimes you get like someone that goes over the top of you because the deck is kind of like a slow mid-rangey deck that doesn't always have all the pieces come together. And then finally, red-white is backup aggro. This is just a deck that can curve out and actually can have some very impressive starts, but you generally want to have some uncommons or maybe even a rare that makes you want to draft this deck. I will say that there are strong rares in all of these color combos that make you want to draft these colors, and that the decks all do kind of function well. I've had good success with red-white, I've had success with red-green, and I've also had success with blue-black and these higher end archetypes. But this is just a general ranking for if you are leaning in a different direction. So if you start with a blue card and then you have the choice between getting a red card or a black card to follow it up with, maybe lean towards that blue-black deck. And similarly, this is just a nice little tiebreaker for your drafts. Moving on to the color rankings, the first thing I want to give is the caveat, which is all of the colors are solid, but this can be a tiebreaker pick for a close pick. And all the colors being solid means there are rares that you'll take early in the draft that make you want to draft these colors. If you take a card like Sunfall, which we showed earlier, you're probably going to want to be playing white, so you can include that in your deck and things of that nature. And when I'm talking about best color, that doesn't mean force this color. And when I'm talking about worst color, it doesn't mean unplayable. They're all definitely playable. They're all solid. And it's more important to find the open color than it is to just play the best color, because you're going to end up with cards that are higher quality if you have the color that is open for your seat at the table. With that said, we're getting to the color rankings. Best is blue. It just fits into the most strong decks. It has good Convoke cards, and it also has some very, very strong cards at common. Preening Champion is very good. It's the 2 in a blue 2/2 flyer that comes with a 1/1, and that card has been very, very impressive and is a card you should be taking very early in your drafts. It also has Afara's Dispersal. I'm sorry I don't have the card images here, but Afara's Dispersal is very good. It's the 2 in a blue, bounce a creature and surveil 2, and then if it targets an attacking creature, it only costs a single blue. That card has been a massive overperformer, and that's a card that also propels blue towards the top. Next is the next tier, which I think black and green kind of get lumped together. Black has great removal and just solid card quality across the board, also has some very good archetype pairings, and then green doesn't have any like standout commons really, but it does have a lot of very solid commons that can really just form the foundation of a deck, and it's good for these splashing decks. And then at the lower end of the color rankings, as I said, just because it's at the worst side doesn't mean it's unplayable, is white and red. White has very solid cards. It just doesn't necessarily have as much card advantage, and sometimes it doesn't pair well with the other colors. And then red has good removal spells, but it's not as deep of a color, where it's not like the 6th and 7th best commons are quite as good as some of the better colors. Next is the format speed. I would say that it's medium fast, mostly because these decks that would typically be slow decks can really benefit from getting on the board early so that they can use their Convoke cards effectively. And that's just something that you'll want to keep in mind, because even if you are playing one of these like decks that tries to win in the late game, having a bunch of 2-drops and even a couple of 1-drops can really get you there faster by letting you Convoke out these late game spells a lot earlier. So Convoke makes every deck want to affect the board early, and so do battles, where battles, even if you don't have them in your deck, you'll want to affect the board early so that your opponent can't flip them very easily and just snowball the game from there. So I would say it's medium, because you don't just lose the game if you miss your 2-drop. There is time to develop, and battles sometimes do make the games last a while because your opponent is killing battles instead of killing you. But I would say that getting onto the board is still important. Next, we're going to moving on to some of my sleeper picks. These are cards that I see very late in my drafts that are actually quite solid. And the first one is Aerial Boost. Now, this is a Convoke card, which I've been talking about. And one of the reasons this card is so good is because you can cast this without actually tapping any of your lands. Because the way Convoke works is the creature can tap for colorless or 1 mana of that creature's color. So if you have 2 creatures in play, one of which is white, you can cast this for 0 mana, which is really nice and can really surprise your opponents, wreck their removal spells if those removal spells are damage based, and also just help you win key combats. Now, the first thing that this is really good for is dealing with battles, because if your opponent has a battle, like say Invasion of Mercadia, you can give your creature +2/+2 in flying, and then attack the battle, and your opponent might not have a blocker for it, and then you can get the flip of the battle, which can often be very powerful and worth using an Aerial Boost to unlock. You also can use it with Kithkin Billy Rider, which is a common you can get very late to hit your opponent for a lot of damage. I think that's a combo that's a little bit underrated probably as well. We're turning double strike creatures. Double strike creatures combine very well with combat tricks, and so if you put the +2/+2 in flying onto the Kithkin Billy Rider, you can attack your opponent for 6 damage instead of 2, and that can be a very significant punch for damage, and also giving it evasion. And then finally, a card like Knight of the New Coalition is also really good with Aerial Boost, because if you play Knight of the New Coalition, you're getting 2 creatures for 1 card, and then those creatures can just tap to cast Aerial Boost. They also have Vigilance, so that they'll be able to do that mid-combat whenever you need to. So that's just a really cool little synergy to be aware of. And then the next sleeper I have, the final sleeper for this video, is Marauding Dreadship. This is a card that I get like second to last pick before, and it's actually remarkably solid because it just comes with a lot of resources. 3 mana for a 4/1 vehicle is pretty nice, and the first thing that it's good for is attacking down battles the same way I talked about for Aerial Boost. And one of the really nice things about Marauding Dreadship is it's a 4/1, and a lot of the battles have 4 on their 4 defense counter. So if you deal 4 damage to them, they'll flip. So like Invasion of Mercadia as an example. And so this is really nice because Marauding Dreadship lets you turn your 3/3 creature that wouldn't be able to threaten to flip the battle immediately into a threat that lets you threaten to flip the battle immediately and can just trade for one of your opponent's cards because they'll probably block it. And then you're just left with this 2/2 incubate token, which is really nice extra upside. So it's just almost going to get you like a 2-for-1 in that regard, because you'll be able to trade the 4/1 off, and then you'll still be left with that 2/2. So just a nice little bit of a value there. You also gain access to the combo with Hanger Scrounger, where if you don't really have good attacks, you can use Hanger Scrounger to crew Marauding Dreadship, even if you've put the backup counter somewhere else. And Hanger Scrounger, when it becomes tapped, lets you discard a card, and if you do, you draw a card. So if you get to these mid-game board stalls in your red deck, and you have access to these commons, which are both commons that you can play in any deck, really, they're just both solid. Hanger Scrounger, probably the one that gets played more currently, but you can crew the Marauding Dreadship and just not even worry about attacking as just a way to start filtering your draws and really win those mid-game board stalls. And then finally, just if you are going to play Marauding Dreadship, any 2-mana creature, you really want it to have 2 power so that you can maximize the odds of going 2-drop that can then on turn 3 crew the Marauding Dreadship so you can hit in for a big chunk of damage. So that's kind of how Marauding Dreadship breaks down, and I think that's actually a pretty solid card that should be making more decks than it currently is. Now, if you are interested in seeing all of this information kind of on one screen, along with some top commons information, I have made this cheat sheet, which can be a little helpful resource for you. And if you're interested in it, it's free. It's on the NicolaiBolas Patreon. You don't need to be a patron to access it. There's a free PDF that you can download, you can print, you can show to your friends, and it'll help you kind of keep tabs of all of this stuff and all of this information in kind of a one photo form. Obviously not with all of my explanation backing it up, but these are the sorts of things that you can take to your draft or something like that. And if you are on the Patreon, I'd also have a tier list for the set where you can see my thoughts on every card in March of the Machine. That's for patrons of any level, but it's only $2 to gain access to that if you are interested in seeing more of my thoughts on the cards. So if you find my sleeper picks helpful, I have updated these rankings very recently so that you'll have access to my most current thoughts on the cards. Anyway, that's going to do it for this video. Thank you so much for watching, and if you made it all the way till the end of the video, leave hashtag TuneUp in the comment section down below, because every machine does need a tune-up from time to time. I really hope you enjoyed this, and I will talk to you next time.